Larry L. Hunt was born in Indiana in 1939 and earned his bachelor's degree from Ball State University before completing MA and PhD degrees in sociology at Indiana University. He spent his entire academic career in the sociology faculty at the University of Maryland. Matthew Hunt graduated from Miami University of Ohio in 1990 and then followed in his father's footsteps at Indiana University to complete his sociology PhD in 1998. After graduation, he joined the sociology faculty at Northeastern University in Boston, where he eventually served as department chair and continues to teach today. He and his father Larry decided to write this paper together right after he graduated, and later wrote several more articles as a father and son team. The literature on the Black church in American society would overflow an entire course or even a college major. This article was chosen to illustrate how people's religious life can be conditioned and shaped by the more general structural conditions in a society, but also to show that religion works as an active force, a resource in the hands of those same people that becomes a key dimension of distinctive ethnic identities. Now we consider the article by the Hunts, father and son, illustrating the role of religion in constructing the ethnic identity of African Americans. We need to keep clearly in mind that our focus here is on the concept of ethnicity, not the more controversial concept of race. Even when discussions of race point out how its conditional and varying content is socially constructed, the race concept almost inevitably leads people into a corner where they argue about characteristics of individual people, especially physiological markers such as skin color or blood type or stature or hair texture and so on. In contrast, our concept of ethnicity is firmly rooted in the web of relationships in which people find themselves. Race could be about different kinds of bugs, but if so, then ethnicity is about the spider's web where we all are fluttering. Research on ethnicity and African Americans shows us two sides of the scholarly coin of ethnogenesis, the process by which a collection of people come to constitute an ethnic group. We can summarize these two sides of the coin as the external structural side and the internal agency side. On the internal agency side of this coin, we emphasize the active efforts of members of such a group. For example, Atkinson pointed out how Wana people were trying consciously to use religion to reinforce their claim to be a real ethnic group, worthy of recognition in the larger society. For African Americans, this same agency appears as people celebrate their roots, their shared culture, and the political and economic strength that can come from group mobilization. From bus boycotts to Black Lives Matter, from soul food restaurants to celebration of African arts and fashion, these social interactions contribute to sustaining a distinctive ethnic group as both a primary social construction, to go back to Barker's terminology, created by interaction among the members of the group themselves, and a secondary social construction created by interactions between members of the group and the surrounding society. But many scholars studying ethnicity are suspicious of this focus on the agency or actions of people in the group as the main explanation for ethnogenesis. Nobody disputes that such conscious ethnicity building happens, but it is also important to ask why it happens. These scholars are more concerned about the other side of the coin that depicts members of an ethnic group not so much as active agents of social construction, but more as passive victims of a dominant surrounding society. The nation-building efforts of the Indonesian government gave us an example of such an external structure in the case of Atkinson's Wana respondents. For African Americans, these external structural conditions began with the arrival of most of their ancestors as involuntary slaves, owned, bred, worked, and beaten by masters who at first even denied that they were human beings, just another form of property. This meant that they had no souls, so religion was forbidden to them. The invisible institution of the slave church arose anyway, behind the backs of the masters, so that from the very beginning, religion was at the heart of the social interactions constructing a black ethnicity. Although chattel slavery was destroyed as a property system, the larger structural context of American society remained in place, with organizations like the Klan to terrorize African Americans and all manner of other exclusionary practices to restrict choice of schools, neighborhoods, jobs, marriage partners, political participation, and most other dimensions of social life. It is easy to see how impossible it would be to understand this ethnogenesis, the construction process of African American ethnicity, unless we see clearly how many of the construction workers on this project were outside the group being created, controlling the fundamental structure of social relationships within which the project was going on. Hunt and Hunt explain quite effectively why religion has been a key building block of African American ethnicity not only from the beginning, but continuously down to the present day. Not only racial prejudice and discrimination by individual citizens, but also persistent, systematic restrictions and requirements maintained by political, legal, and economic policies of governments and private businesses all have continued to shape the social boundaries within which African Americans must live. Both sides of the ethnogenesis coin are real, both the structural constraints and the active responses of African Americans themselves. The separation of church and state, however, created one exception to the power of American society to dictate the conditions of African American life. Within their churches, at first hidden from the slave masters, but still today overwhelmingly separate and segregated, African Americans find one upward path open to them, and of course they take it. The black church in America, intensively studied now for generations, provides community coordination and support for its members in the face of a hostile surrounding society. It also creates a social space within which people can establish self-respect and respectability and even opportunities for achievement. It is no accident that nearly all African American civil rights leaders emerged from church pulpits into wider fields of authority. Actually, of course, there's never been just one black church in America. Several denominational strands developed along quite different historical paths. For example, Southern Baptists split from the National Baptist denomination shortly before the Civil War because some Northern Baptists were prominent abolitionists. Like other denominations in the South, Baptists historically included their slaves within their own churches, forcing them to worship from separate galleries up around the walls of the sanctuaries. This allowed them to keep an eye on the slaves even during church. But after the Civil War, these former slaves left the buildings and organized their own black Baptist churches, leaving the white Southern Baptists by themselves in their old congregations. The famous Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King Jr. preached in Atlanta, was one of these breakaway segregated black Baptist churches. Another major strand connected former slaves in the South to northern churches in Methodist and Episcopalian denominations, which even sent development missions into the southern states to help in organizing what became the African Methodist Episcopal, or AME, Church. There's every bit as much denominational diversity and confusion in the black church as anywhere else in religion in America. But the Hunts also point out to us one highly interesting consequence of the unique role of churches in African American ethnicity. The idea from their title of this article of the black church as a semi-involuntary institution. It may seem ironic to use the term involuntary to describe the black church, given its crucial place in coping with the challenges facing African Americans both before and since the end of involuntary slavery. But the idea is very simple and deserves our attention. For people hemmed in on every side by legal and economic restrictions blocking their freedom to achieve and become respectable, every strand of the black church historically offered the one path open to such achievement and self-respect. For African Americans who aspired to be somebody long before that became a slogan, this church was often, quite literally, the only game in town. Strictly speaking, no law said you had to be active in your church, but the push of community pressure and the pull of opportunity to make something of yourself meant that if going to church was not actually involuntary, we could be justified to say that it was at least semi-involuntary. Saying that church attendance is semi-involuntary simply means that social forces are at work influencing whether we get out of bed in the morning and go to church or not. That makes church a lot like almost every other aspect of our lives, and in a way our lives are all semi-involuntary from top to bottom. But here we mean that the decision is out of our hands even more than usual. The hypothesis suggests that African Americans face stronger social pressures than the general population to attend church. The Hunts suggest that we compare different regions of the country as one kind of test of this hypothesis. For example, restrictions and discrimination that close all other doors to advancement and respectability for African Americans may be stronger, particularly in the rural areas of southern states where Jim Crow laws and segregation have been deeply ingrained for many generations. If all other outlets for achievement are systematically blocked, the pull of opportunity into the black church should be particularly strong there. The Hunts guess that by comparison, in northern cities, the exclusion may not be so deeply ingrained or complete, and there may be other opportunities for advancement and respectability that compete with church attendance for African Americans living there. In addition to this variable strength of the pull of opportunity into churches, scholars such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Andrew Billingsley, and many others have suggested that the deeply ingrained patterns of segregation and discrimination, particularly in the American South, contributed to the survival and even expansion of powerful family loyalties and other community connections that helped African Americans survive both during and after slavery. This stronger, more interwoven and concentrated network of community ties, again hypothesized to be most prominent in the rural South, could exert a stronger push on the members of all those families to stay visibly involved in the black church that has been so central to creating, defining, and sustaining African American ethnicity as a group identity. These reinforcing hypotheses of a greater pull into the church, resulting from blocked alternatives for achievement, and a greater push into the church, resulting from a persistent, elaborate, kin-based sense of community, both lead the Hunts to expect that we will find church attendance to be least voluntary of all in the rural South. There, more than anywhere else, they expect to find church attendance for everyone, whether people feel like going to church themselves or not. This less voluntary aspect of the black church in the rural South should appear in many specific patterns that we can look for empirically to see whether there's anything to this idea. For one thing, there should be just plain higher rates of church attendance for African Americans in the rural areas of southern states, compared to either cities in the South or people living outside the South entirely. In the general social survey data that the Hunts explore, this attendance is measured for all respondents by the old familiar scale from 0 for never go to church to 8 for several times a week. All we have to do is average the scores for different regions of the country and compare the averages. As we know well by now, though, there are a lot of potential confusing factors that could interfere with simple rates of attendance. In some studies, people with more money and education appear to be less religious than poorer, less educated people. Here we turn that pattern seen elsewhere completely on its head. Our hypothesis about the pull and push into the black church as the only game in town means that people are actually using church not only to display their prosperity and success, but even that going to church itself gives you higher status and respect in the community. This means that we actually expect people with more money and education to go to church more often, not less. And in places like the rural South, where this hypothesis is supposed to apply more strongly, the concentration of church attendance among the most educated African Americans in the community should also actually be stronger than in other places. We also could say that if church attendance is semi-involuntary, we should expect to find more people going to church who are not all that religious in their personal lives. who are going simply because everybody expects them to be there, because it marks them as worthy and respectable. Without such social opportunities and pressures, people in church should be more self-selected for personal religiosity, but when the semi-involuntary hypothesis kicks in, those deeply religious people in the pews will be diluted by additional less religious folks who are just there to see and be seen. If we ask people about their religious attitudes, we should find that such attitudes don't predict church attendance as strongly in the rural South. Beyond this personal aspect of religiosity, we also face a problem of denominational differences that could confuse the emerging picture. Some denominations, especially fundamentalist ones, could well put more importance on regular attendance than others. And if those denominations appeared more often in the rural South, then all we really have is a denomination effect, nothing to do with individual people at all. So the Hunts also decide to add in the denominations reported by people in the general social survey data that they inspect. Finally, they also give us two more possible tests to consider, having to do with differences in religiosity we've already considered between men and women, and between people who are married or single. As we know, many studies around the world suggest that men seem less religious than women on many indicators, including both actions like church attendance and attitudes like the importance of religion. But to the extent that church is not a purely voluntary individual decision, to the extent that we find a semi-involuntary institution offering the only game in town, the attendance deficit that we typically find for men should be smaller, because they, just as much as women, feel the community pressure to get to church. And perhaps because they, even more than women, feel the pull of possible status gains and even career achievement that they may find in church. By the same logic, if church is the central institution for both displaying and achieving status and respectability in the community, married men should be going to church a lot more than single men. In all, then, we have a whole list of plausible predictions that should allow us to test whether this semi-involuntary institution business has anything to it. We can look for each of these predicted differences between African Americans living in the rural South, in southern cities, and outside the South, and see whether the predictions are right. If they are right, maybe there is something to the hypothesis, though of course you might actually come up with some other explanation. But if they turn out to be wrong, we can drop the whole idea as interesting to think about, but not the way the world really works. So with that, let's go and see what the Hunts discovered. As you might expect from research that got published in Soc Forces, one of the leading social science research journals, the father and son team of the Hunts found actual empirical results from general social survey data that turned out to confirm most, if not all, of their hypotheses. First of all, in their Table 1, we see two of the three regions they considered, the rural South and the urban South, listed as the first two factors in their analysis. For GSS respondents living in these regions of the country, one or the other of these variables was coded as a 1, while everybody else got a 0. For people living outside the South altogether, everybody got zeros on both of them, so this non-South group is the reference category that they left out. The constant at the bottom of the column is the church attendance score for these non-Southern African Americans. By comparison to this reference group, African Americans in the urban South averaged about 2/3 of a point higher on the attendance scale, and those in the rural South scored 3/4 of a point higher. This looks like the pattern they expected based on the semi-involuntary institution hypothesis. Of course, being good sociologists, they know that these significant differences could be compositional effects if more of the African Americans in the South have other characteristics that go along with church attendance. So they add in all those other possible confusing factors that they can think of and that are measured in the general social survey. And we can see, looking down the column for Model 4 on the right side of the table, that all of those other facts about people do indeed also predict whether they go to church or not. But after we take account of all of them, there is still a very large, significant positive coefficient in the model for both the rural South and the urban South going to church a lot more than people outside the South. This is not quite what they started out thinking, because they expected the rural South to be significantly less voluntary about church than the cities. But we see here that the southern cities also have a lot of church-going reported by the GSS respondents. In fact, the difference between rural and urban areas within the South pretty much disappears after we add in all those other factors. So we might need to rethink the hypothesis, or we may need to rethink how we look at southern cities as well as the rural areas. Many southern cities have some very interesting and controversial histories of laws about residential opportunities, voting rights, and other political questions, and here they don't look that different from the small towns out in the countryside. Moving on to the more detailed expectations set out by the Hunts, we turn to their Table 2, where they go beyond just adding in all these other factors shown on the right in Table 1. That kind of model assumes that all those factors work in exactly the same way in all three of the regions. But all the rest of the hypotheses the Hunts want to test actually say this should not be the case. The other factors should actually work differently in the rural South. So they have to split the GSS respondents into three separate groups and then fit all their other predictors to each group in turn. When they do this, for example, we see that being a woman means you go to church more often than a man. But this gender deficit for the men is about 3/4 of a point on the attendance scale in the urban South and also in the non-South, but less than half a point in the rural South. Those guys in the rural South are closer to the women in those places in their church attendance, just as we would expect if they had less purely voluntary choice about whether to go to church. In the same way, we see that church attendance was a lot higher for people who belong to fundamentalist churches than for those in mainline denominations like AME. But this was a strong, significant effect only in the urban South and the non-South. When we look at the rural South, there's only a tiny, statistically insignificant coefficient for this distinction. The main denominations in the rural South were actually going to church just as much as everybody else. Again, what you might expect if people feel like they don't really have much choice about attendance, that it is expected, semi-involuntary. The distinctiveness of the rural South is not quite so dramatic when we look at how strongly religious the GSS respondents were. Being more religious predicts a very significant increase in church attendance, but this increase again is less in the rural South than in other regions, even though it is still significant. So this row in Table 2 gives at least partial, moderate support to the semi-involuntary institution hypothesis. Finally, we see the usual relation of education to church attendance does indeed stand on its head in this table. Instead of more prosperous, educated people being less religious, among these African American respondents, we see that the more educated you are, the more you go to church. There are positive coefficients all the way across this row. They all get at least 1 star for statistical significance. But here again, the value for the rural South pops up as nearly 3 times higher than the coefficients for the other 2 regions and gets 3 stars for significance. We have yet another confirmation of what we expected to find based on the semi-involuntary institution hypothesis. It is little wonder when we consider results like these that every politician knows that if you want the political support of African American voters, particularly in the South, and apparently particularly in the rural regions of the South, then you have to start with the churches. With the pastors on your side, you can hardly fail. Without them, you haven't much chance. This semi-involuntary institution hypothesis proves to be an interesting way to actually measure in quantitative terms the fundamental importance of the Black church and of religious identity in defining and sustaining the ethnic identity of African Americans.